Thanks, Charlie, and thanks. It's lovely to see so many familiar and to meet the faces and to meet some new people here today. And thanks for the introduction to New Orleans last night. So I just wanted to talk uncharacteristically to have a sort of text-light presentation for once, and just talk about some of the things I've had to think through about when we think about using these agents in low middle income countries, and just be interested to engage with you about some of these things. These are my disclosures. I think it's really important to understand that things are never going to be the same again in our region of the world. It doesn't even matter if PEPFAR comes back en masse. I think the way we're going to be engaging around funding and around how funds get used in HIV programs is going to be fundamentally different. And I think that, and as it should, I think that the way things have just, certainly in my country, where PEPFAR and the Department of Health just kind of happily went along together in parallel, that ecosystem has completely been disrupted. And in various ways, it's going to play itself out. Now, I don't know how. At the moment, it's a catastrophe. And all the governments are clamming up. They will tell you everything's fine, including mine. But it really is not fine. And things are going badly. And they're going to continue to be bad for the rest of this year. And I don't know how it's all going to end up. There's no magic hero coming over the hill to come bail everybody out. But I think the ecosystem is going to be disrupted. It doesn't mean everything gets put on hold. And I think these long-acting agents do hold promise in different ways, but they are different things. And this is the one graph that Chris Byra put up at CROI, which I think must make us all pause. And it's the degree to which PrEP in particular was totally dependent on external funding. Many of the country programs, the treatment programs were actually, particularly in South Africa, were actually holding themselves together with local funding. Places like Kenya, Botswana, Namibia, they were okay. Every single country in the region's PrEP program has completely stopped. So when we talk about lenacapavir for PrEP and cabotegravir programs, those programs have stopped completely. We've been, the South African government has been given a certain level of cabotegravir, for instance, that's been offered to us because they have no idea of how to use it for PrEP. So it's very important to understand when we are talking about these agents and making them go to scale, this actually chills me, because PrEP is where our immediate access to these long-acting agents is probably going to come from. Treatment, I'm going to talk about the complexity of this, but where we need these things to land, there's nothing to land at the moment. And it was hard enough to begin with. And I'll talk a little bit about this. But we need to be thinking about this when we start engaging with governments, because we're going to need a different way of engaging. And there are ways, and I think that we just need to be a bit creative about it. It's not, this looks very bleak, but there are different ways of doing this, and we just need to be thinking about those different ways. So we were talking about money yesterday around the MABs, and this is the one area that I for one am actually quite upbeat about. I feel like we can solve this problem, like with enough time, with enough smart people around the table, with enough drive, we seem to be able to solve the money problem. When we were working on the dolutegravir program, when we were looking at efavirenz-based programs, it cost about somewhere between $100 and $120 per year for treatment. So efavirenz-based tenofovir, lamivudine, or emtricitabine in our case, efavirenz-based therapy was $120 a year. Prior to this PEPFAR disaster, it came down to just over $40 a year. I mean, it's remarkable how scale drives prices down. So when you were having that discussion about MABs yesterday, I was listening, to a whole lot of smart people talking about how it'll come down in price. I actually do think there's something to be said about that. But there are also things we need to be thinking about all the time, is that while this is surmountable, one of the things that is difficult at the moment is that the negotiations between the three prime drugs we're talking about, cabotegravir, lenacapavir, and rilpivirine, it's very opaque, the discussions around these three drugs. We've had endless troubles getting access to cabotegravir just for the most basic implementation projects. Lenacapavir, in this editorial we put out a few weeks ago, talked about the difficulties we have got to engage with Gilead around this. And J&J has just kind of disappeared. Like, we can't seem to get them to talk to them about access to rilpivirine whatsoever. So, in the past, both talking certainly to ViiV and Gilead, it's been very easy when it's come to MPP and the amazing work that they've done. But to get to the stage where we can actually get these drugs out, because they're real implementation challenges, is hard. And we're going to need access to the drugs to actually build the platforms to actually get them at scale. It's one thing to do 50 patients. It's another thing altogether to do 1,000. So that's one thing we have to do. The other thing and this is the non-sexy stuff, the people who negotiated suppliers in the past in Africa were USAID. And we all know what's happened to USAID in the last 3 months. They're just gone. So the entire African supply lines were negotiated through one pretty much group. Once countries start doing this country by country, they have to negotiate with generic companies. It's going to be not a very good, it's not a great place for negotiation. So again, that amazing $40, $50 sort of price tag is going to be a mess until we have some sort of centralized group that can do it. And maybe that's going to be through the Global Fund. Maybe there's some magical UN agency that's going to come to save us. But that procurement power that came with centralizing that is no longer there. So the whole ecosystem has been disrupted, and we're going to have to think about how that's going to realign once we need to get that stuff up and running. So this was the other thing that I had to think about, is around the treatment combinations. Now, the one we've got at the moment is cabotegravir rilpivirine, and from what I can see, there's nothing else on the horizon in terms of combinations that's coming anytime soon. We've heard, particularly yesterday, about particularly in these non-adherent population groups, how useful this combination is and how transformative it actually is for these groups of patients. And I was a complete skeptic about this combination. I thought there was no real role for it, but I think increasingly starting to think that this is really important for those patients who just simply cannot take tablets, who are able to make their appointments but just can't make. Certainly in our group, the adolescents would be the immediate group of things. The other combinations seem to be years away, and we're going to have to make do with what we've got at the moment. And this combination, as I said, it's difficult because J&J just doesn't seem to be engaging whatsoever. But if we are going to be able to get there, this is the combination we have to, from a treatment perspective, in certainly low and middle income countries, is the one we're going to have to engage around. One of the epiphanies I had at the Glasgow conference was sitting around at one of the ViiV meetings I was at, and with a whole lot of treatment experienced doctors, and they were all doctors, feeling like, the African in the room with the least experience. And the largest site there was 100 patients. Now, I must tell you that 100 patients in my environment is a tiny rural clinic. That's not scale. That is an afterthought. If we're going to take this to scale, we're talking about 5,000, 6,000 patients in a site. And they talked very convincingly about once they got to 100, no one was coping. They couldn't schedule it. They couldn't roll out the injections fast enough. We are going to have to work out how to get people through the door in a kind of Fordist way, which is not for the treatment program. I'm not talking about PrEP, which is not sort of juggling 100 patients. That might be okay in Berlin. It's not going to work in African sites. We are going to have to get this stuff to get to scale. And to do that, we are going to have volumes of drugs to start testing those things. And it's going to have to, those sites are going to have to work much, much more efficiently than they're doing at the moment. So this was a bit of an eye-opener for me, because I was kind of thinking this is not going to be that hard. And maybe it's just that eventually the injections will evolve so that they're easier to give, but it was much more than that. It seemed to be all sorts of logistical things that are going to have to be handled. And I think this is the thing that primary healthcare sites, certainly in my environment, but even looking at rich countries, are not great at dealing with this stuff. And I think we have to think about this is we are going to have a major retooling of the system as we move to injectables. It's not an emergency because this stuff is not going to be around next year. It's coming, but it's not going to be around immediately. But if we are going to be moving across to these long-acting injectables, we have to think, how do we do that? And that picture of Cape Town, of an infusion center, those are the kind of things I think that kind of revolution in the system is going to have to start happening. And then the next thing is prevention. And I was having this chat with Charlie and with Dan yesterday, and with prevention, when you think about it, at the moment, there's probably 10 people on treatment for, maybe 30 or 40 people on treatment for every one person on prevention. That scale should be the other way around. There probably should be anything between 20 and 100 people on prevention for every one person on treatment. And people say, oh, but we're still getting there. We've had PrEP for how long? 15, 18 years now. By that time in ARV land, we had scaled up by now, and we really haven't. And I just want to use South Africa as an example because my government loves to beat its chest about being the most successful PrEP program in the world. And I'm like, yes, you are, but you're still a complete dismal failure if you look at the PrEP numbers and numbers of people there. We've had, you can see, we registered, the oral PrEP since 2015. 10 years later, we've got 1.2 million people on PrEP. And most of those, I can assure you, are restarts. They're not, they are not like 1.2 million new people there. We start around 600,000 people on ARVs every year. Honestly, it's homeopathic prevention that we're talking about with PrEP. So if we are going to scale up PrEP, we are really going to have to think about how we're going to do this and do this properly. So it's not just the fact that the injections are a challenge, but even PrEP itself is such a major challenge. And again, it's going to have to get creative. And this is a worldwide problem. It's not just a low and middle income country problem. Is that prevention at the moment, how we get to these key populations, to high-risk people, and even the general population in certainly places like South Africa and so the Southern African region, we are going to have to make leaps and bounds of faith and creativity that is going to take this way beyond what we're doing at the moment with PrEP. The other thing I often think about is the hepatitis B question, because I have some frustration with the hepatitis B people, because it's like, thou shalt not throw away the TAF and the tenofovir until you've sorted out hepatitis B. And I kind of want to say to them, it's like, no, you sort it out now. We cannot be held hostage. Dual therapy and these therapeutics for treatment cannot be held hostage to hepatitis B for the rest of the time. It's the same as TB in the past. Now, probably at the moment in treatment programs, 0.1 or 0.2% of people have active TB when they start ARVs, because we've been so good with our INH prophylaxis programs and everything else, so it's not really a big deal. But Hep B is common in places like Mozambique. Up to 60-70% in the northern areas have got chronic Hep B. But we'll never be able to move to these injectable agents if we continue to have this discussion about Hep B. And no one comes up with a solution. It's just like, no, you have to solve it but you can't come and talk to us. Now, do you kind of want to throw it back and say, what is the solution? Do we start screening? Do we vaccinate? What do we do here? But what's not on the table is this kind of algorithm that we're going to take forward. And I do get quite frustrated sometimes about the hepatitis B question, because, it's like, at what point do we say we're just going to move forward with dual therapy and let things happen? Because there is going to come a point, we kind of did that at some point with TB. We just went forward. And we are going to have to start saying is like, what is the algorithm around it? What screening tests are we going to do? When we moved to tenofovir from D4T, everyone talked about creatinine monitoring, knowing full well that nobody looked at the creatinine. And I do worry there's going to come a stage where that's the same thing we're going to start doing when we start screening for hepatitis B, is we're not actually going to look at it. There's no dual therapy that covers hepatitis B. And you're going to have to ask me, is like, which system is going to start having tenofovir in the system and 3TC in the system once you've screened for hepatitis B as a completely alternative additive on it? And we are going to need to engage properly with the hepatitis B people to come up with a decent strategy for taking this forward. I'm almost done. So the other thing I think that is interesting is thinking about the dual oral long-acting therapies, and particularly the weekly therapy. The oral combination of lenacapavir and islatravir is probably going to be registered in the next little while. And the phase 2 data is very, very promising. It looks very cheap to make. It looks very potent. Hopefully some of these toxicity issues will have resolved. But, PEPFAR spent literally billions of dollars on multi-month dispensing around oral therapies. Now we can just hand them 28 tablets for like 6 months. You got rid of all of that hassle factor. You don't have to re-engineer the entire system. You just have to give them a few tablets there and then. And it's really interesting to think about how we could leapfrog there while we're waiting for these long-acting injectable agents to come along. It may be, as I said, when we look at the manufacturing costs, it may be very, very cheap. And there's no need for this new system to get there. We do have to start thinking about new adherence systems, and certainly I haven't had to think about weekly tablets, but we can go and speak to the psychiatrists because they've certainly been able to do that. I did have one more choice. I was listening to people going on about choice, which is one of those like PC terms everyone loves to throw about. And I'd love to ask you, in your health system, how much choice you actually have, which antihypertensive, you get to choose which ACE inhibitor you want and which one, because that doesn't actually operate in my medical system. You know, you get a choice as to whether you want an injectable contraceptive or an oral contraceptive stuff in my health system. But beyond that, there is no choice. And I don't think there's much choice in most people's healthcare systems. So despite all this talking about choice, there are choices about what route of administration you get. And I think that probably is the case. And certainly from our system, systems hate choice, you know, for good reason, because there's only so much stocking you can do. And health workers in particular hate choice because then it's just less to explain. But when we've started to hand out PrEP, and this is something I think is really important for the treatment people to be thinking about, when we've offered them cabotegravir and oral PrEP, consistently 2/3 of the patients prefer the injectable and 1/3 prefer the oral. So a significant number of them still want the oral. A couple of them have moved back to oral because they don't like the pain of the injections. And we've seen that across different communities in South Africa and some of the other sort of formative work that we've seen. So I think we're likely to see, whether it's 80-20 or even 90-10, I think you are going to see a mix of these two methods. So we do need to keep in the back of our mind that we're not going to be able to just go with one form. There probably is going to need to be a little bit of a choice within the system to be able to provide this to people. There was an interesting discussion, I added this in, around site preference. We've seen the same thing. People actually really do prefer going to the clinic for their injections. This idea of self-administration, getting it, you know, at home, getting it at school, we put this all to people. People actually do quite like going to a healthcare worker and giving the administration there. So I think we need to keep doing this kind of formative work to have a look at it and seeing how, to what extent where people prefer to getting this stuff done, and how close to the clinic it needs to be. That Uganda, you know, those wet, muddy roads, I think is one thing. But if you are able to just, you know, get your injection fairly close in a fairly convenient time, perhaps people do prefer just going to a place where the healthcare worker can give it to you. So just in summary, I think we are going to anticipate there's going to be mixed administration methods and that healthcare worker oversight is actually quite valued when it comes to this. So in conclusion, I think the PEPFAR withdrawal is just going to be an ongoing challenge, and we're just going to have to negotiate that. I don't know what it looks like. I really don't at this stage. It's still an absolute mess across the region, and each country it's a different mess. We've just got to look at scale, and this, for both treatment and PrEP, we haven't got there yet. And for these long-acting agents, it is the test, is how much we can get to that scale. I do think these weekly and potentially even monthly oral tablets in the far future for the monthly ones are going to be an interesting thing to add to the mix, and we haven't maybe thought about it enough. There is the adherence challenge, which I certainly haven't thought about enough, but which is going to be interesting, but which we need to be adding to what we think. It's not just about the injectables that we need to be thinking. And then finally, we are going to have to think, if we are going to scale around the injectables, we are going to have to probably look at fairly significant systems administration changes within the clinics for how to get beyond simply 100. Because if we are going to get to thousands and thousands of people, we are going to have probably beds with, you know, injection people moving from bed to bed to give these injections, because the current system is definitely not going to be operate as we've done in the past. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.